In this video, we'll look at George Washington's foreign relations. And the biggest foreign issue for almost every nation at the time was the continued war between the powers of France and Great Britain. The French Revolution began in 1789, and 4 years later, France's new Republican government went to war against a British-led coalition of monarchies. The French Revolution eventually turned into the infamous Reign of Terror, tyranny of the masses, and resulted in the rise of a dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte, in the late 1790s, who launched an effort to build a French empire and thus again did battle with Great Britain. Throughout it all, America had to trade, and how do we balance this battle between these two trading partners? It was a difficult thing for Washington and a lot of countries. This debate over how the United States should respond is going to play out in the emerging partisan tensions between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, much to Washington's dismay. Washington declared America neutral, and declaring America neutral was Washington's first important decision in foreign policy. And it angered many who favored France and thought that, they'd come to our aid not long before in the American Revolution, and we owed it to them to come to their aid now. Washington knew that as a neutral carrier, American ships could pass through the British naval blockade along the French coastline. And also, with France unable to continue her sugar trade, which is very lucrative with her colonies, the American merchant marine took advantage of the situation. The American merchant fleet became one of the largest in the world. It increased from 335,000 tons in 1790 to more than 1.1 million tons in 1808. Commercial earnings rose tremendously, averaging $20 million annually in the 1790s, twice the value of cotton and tobacco exports. At shipyards, you saw a lot of investment and there was a lot of profit in making vessels, and it provided work for thousands of carpenters, masons, and seamen. Not surprisingly, port cities boomed. Real estate values skyrocketed. The total property value for New York City, for example, jumped from $5.8 million in 1790 to $20.7 million in 1799. And so, this war and America's neutrality kind of worked to America's advantage initially. As the war dragged on, however, it became increasingly hard for George Washington and the United States to remain neutral. Many Americans favored France and celebrated the death of Louis XVI, which you can see here. When Louis XVI was beheaded, some Americans held a dinner in Philadelphia where, as one observer noted, that, quote, the head of a roasted pig was severed from its body and being recognized as an emblem of the murdered King of France was carried round to the guest. Each one placing the cap of liberty on its head pronounced the word tyrant. Some Americans began to address each other as citizen, as the French did each other as a symbol of equality. They, if not only had France come to America's aid in the Revolution, but France seemed to be following on the Enlightenment principles America had been established on. Others, however, primarily merchants and wealthy plantation owners who had lucrative business dealings with the British, favored Great Britain. The horrors of the French Revolution also scared many Americans. Predictably, the existing but growing political factions split on this issue like they did on Hamilton's economic agenda. Hamilton's followers of the emerging Federalist Party tended to favor Great Britain, while Jefferson's followers, the emergent Democratic Republicans, tended to favor France. Washington wanted to remain above it, and he also wanted to maintain American neutrality. But once again, what he's going to do is going to put him more in Hamilton's camp. When the Royal Navy began to seize American ships bound for France, which was a big escalation of tensions, Washington dispatched an emissary to negotiate with the British. The emissary was New York lawyer John Jay, and his treaty that he negotiated with the British became known as the Jay Treaty, shown to the right here. It allowed American merchants to submit claims to the British government for compensation of illegal seizures, but it also gave the British many concessions as well. It allowed Britain to stop the ships, inspect them, and remove any French property. The U.S. also agreed to pay all that was owed to British merchants by pre-revolution trade. This meant that the U.S. would have to pay a considerable sum for the taxes and regulations that they earlier argued were illegal and unfair. As Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans complained, the Senate ratified it by a 20-10 vote, the bare two-thirds majority required by the Constitution. So the Democratic Republicans were kind of angry at Washington for dispatching Jay, and they just didn't like Jay's treaty. But there was one undisputed positive thing that everybody agreed that came from all of this, and it revolved around Spain. Spain was worried about the improving British-American relations, as shown in the Jay's Treaty. Anyway, Washington had dispatched an American diplomat, Thomas Pinckney, to try to negotiate a deal with Spain to allow American ships to pass through their port of New Orleans down the Mississippi River. And that he did, and the treaty became known as Pinckney's Treaty. And, it allowed them to not only to navigate through the port of New Orleans, but to deposit goods at the port. And it even allowed, the Spanish even allowed their northern boundary of Florida to be at the 31st parallel, which is what the U.S. had wanted, and not above, which is where the Spanish earlier had advocated. So this was, everybody agreed, a positive reaction that, kind of flowed from Jay's Treaty. The French, of course, were worried about the improving American-British relations, and so they dispatched a emissary to the United States, Edmond Genet. And this French ambassador was aware that Washington and the central government tended to favor Britain. So rather than disembark at the nation's capital, New York City at the time, and come to Washington, what he did was he disembarked in the South, and he was going to go to the state capitals to argue for France, for aid to France. And the southern states were the more Democratic Republicans. And so, this Genet affair kind of dissed the central government in Washington. I should note that the French Revolution, however, made it unsafe for Genet, who was a nobleman himself, for him to return to France. So he had to appeal for asylum, and so what he had to do was, he had to go to New York City after all and appeal for asylum from George Washington. And so he kind of had to eat it, Washington, in typical fashion, allowed him to get political asylum and thus the right to stay in the United States. But, you do see Washington angered by the French and the whole Genet affair, as it was termed. Indian relations could also strain America's relations with European countries. Down in the area that the Spanish had just ceded their claims above Florida, the Panhandle of Florida, with Pinckney's Treaty, there was an Indian named Alexander McGivery. And Alexander McGivery had been aided by the Spanish, in spite of their promise to, to not harass the Americans above Florida, above the 31st parallel. But Alexander McGivery was still raiding there when he had Spanish weapons and all that. And so what ends up happening was Washington is going to invite this Native American, Alexander McGivery, and obviously that's an anglicized name, to invite him to New York, and they're going to see if they can get him to stop raiding. And Washington ended up paying him $100,000 to stop fighting. Now, this is going to anger many Americans because the federal government hadn't helped them with their Indian problems. And, of course, people said, hey, you're taking everybody's tax dollars and you're helping those settlers just above Florida by paying off the Indians raiding in them, but you haven't paid off any Indians raiding us and so forth. So this was a controversial thing that Washington did. At the same time, up in the Northwest, the Great Lakes area, in spite of improving relations with Britain, the British were still, they were still aiding the Indians up there, and that was, against the Treaty of Paris and everything else. And so, what ended up happening there was that Washington dispatches a army unit led by General Anthony Wayne to lead an expedition to put down to attack once and for all these Indians who are again fighting with British weapons. In August 1794, what is near the present-day area of Toledo, Ohio, Anthony Wayne defeated Indians in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The result was the Treaty of Greenville, again, that's Greenville, Ohio, in which the Indians renounced their ownership of the Ohio area. The United States in the same treaty recognized Northwest Indian ownership of much of the rest of the area they had gained by the Treaty of Paris and in the Revolution. But that was, obviously a promise the United States didn't keep with those Indians. They're eventually going to claim that area. But this is going to conclude the video on George Washington's foreign policies, which again were controversial.